Simplified, the what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we'll be analyzing the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 14th February 2019. The topics to be discussed today are reflected on your screen and the time stamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. So let's begin. This news appears on page number 5 and is talking about an initiative of the Kerala Health Department which has brought in an action plan to generate public awareness regarding the harmful effects of trans fats. So as part of our discussion, in addition to looking at the campaign which the Kerala government has started, we'll be basically talking about what exactly is the trans fat. So from the perspective of a syllabus, in the prelims, it will come under the category of science, and for your mains, it will form part of both GS paper 2 and GS paper 3. In GS paper 3, it will be part of science and technology, whereas under GS paper 2, it will come under governance in the subcategory of issues relating to the development and management of health. Now the fats are one of the 3 macronutrients which provide energy for the proper functioning of the metabolic system of a body. And in addition to being a source of energy, fat is very important in our body for the absorption of certain kind of vitamins like vitamin A, D, E and K, because some of the vitamins are only fat soluble. So if we do not have fat in our body, various vitamins will not be absorbed by our body. As far as the types of fats are concerned, the fats are broadly divided into 2 categories. One is the saturated fat and the other is the unsaturated fat. Now the major difference between a saturated and an unsaturated fat is in their chemical structure. So if you look in this diagram here, you will notice that a saturated fat is a fat which contains only single bond. In this picture you can see everywhere there is a single bond in its chemical structure. Whereas in an unsaturated fat, there is at least one double bond present. So in this diagram you will see that here a double bond is present. So even from the name you can make out that saturated means that the fat is saturated with the hydrogen atoms and that it cannot take or add in any more hydrogen atom. Whereas an unsaturated fat, as the name suggests, is unsaturated and has the possibility of including one or more hydrogen atoms into its composition. So thus the main difference between a saturated and an unsaturated fat is based on their chemical composition, where a saturated fat contains only a single bond and an unsaturated fat contains at least one double bond. Now because of the chemical structure, the second difference between the two is related to their physical state while in room temperature. Now since we know that saturated fats, because of the chemical structure, have no room for more hydrogen atoms, therefore they are usually found in a solid state in room temperature. On the other hand, the unsaturated fats, again due to the chemical structure, are usually existing in a liquid state in the room temperature. Now though this physical state in room temperature cannot be a very certain criteria to differentiate between the two, but usually saturated fats are present in a solid form in room temperature, whereas unsaturated fats are present in a liquid form in room temperature. The third difference is that saturated fats do not spoil quickly, which is very obvious also. Since the chemical composition in a saturated fat is saturated, that is to say it's completely full and has no room for much chemical reaction with the outside environment, hence they do not spoil very quickly. On the other hand, unsaturated fat, since they have the tendency to accept another hydrogen atom, therefore they have more chances of reacting with the elements present in the outside environment, hence they spoil quickly. That is to say, they do not have a very long shelf life, whereas saturated fat have a long shelf life. Fourthly is the sources of these two fats. Saturated fats usually come from your poultry, that is your animal meat including beef, pork, red meat, etc., and is also found in dairy products like cheese, butter, milk, etc. In addition to these two, saturated fats are of course found in fried food as well as packaged foods. On the other hand, unsaturated fats are good fats which are contained in nuts like walnuts, peanuts, in various plants oil like olive oil, canola oil, flaxseed oil, etc., avocados and other various products. So usually saturated fats are considered as bad fats and unsaturated fats are considered as good fat. The last and the major difference between the two is that a saturated fat, which is considered as a bad fat, increases the LDL in our body, and the unsaturated or the good fat increases the HDL in our body and reduces the LDL. Now, LDL and HDL are type of cholesterol about which we will discuss when we talk about trans fats. Now, the trans fatty acids or trans fats are the most harmful type of fats which can have much more adverse effect on our body than any other dietary constituent. Now, though these fats are largely produced artificially, but a small amount of it also occurs naturally. Artificial trans fats are formed when hydrogen atoms are added to liquid vegetable oil in order to produce fats which resemble pure ghee or butter. Hence, through the process of hydrogenation, when hydrogen atoms are made to react with vegetable oils, then as a result of that reaction, trans fatty acids are produced. In our diet, the major source of artificial trans fatty acids are primarily partially hydrogenated vegetable oil or the PHVO, which is also known as Vanaspati. So therefore, when we eat or consume any product which is made in Vanaspati or these partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, we are consuming large amount of fatty acids. And usually most of your fast foods and fried foods like French fries, burgers, pizzas, cakes, pastries, etc., all of these are actually produced in this PHVO. Secondly, it brings us to the question that why in the first place trans fatty acids are produced. The reason is that trans fatty acids increases the shelf life of an ordinary vegetable oil because the products which are made in these vegetable oils will have a longer shelf life and can be preserved for much longer time. And it is for this reason only that these trans fatty acids which are found in Vanaspati are more suitable for frying and are used by the food processing industry to prepare food, especially fast food. Therefore, since trans fatty acid containing oils can be preserved longer, they give the food the desired shape and texture and can also substitute pure ghee. In addition to these three, they are far cheaper in cost and thus add to profit and saving. Thirdly, though the consumption of the TFA containing oil is increasing, but this trans fatty acid has various adverse effects on the health. The major one is that it increases the risk of heart diseases, especially cardiovascular diseases. And the reason for that is that it increases the LDL or the bad cholesterol in our body and reduces the HDL or the good cholesterol. So from your UPSC perspective, trans fatty acids become very important, and what you basically need to remember about them is that they are usually produced artificially by adding hydrogen to vegetable oil. Now, another very logical thing which you have to remember here is that this hydrogen is obviously added to unsaturated fat because it is only your unsaturated fat which has the place to take an additional hydrogen atom into its chemical structure. The most common sources of your trans fatty acids would be PHVO or Vanaspati as well as all the products which are made in these oils. The reasons TFA is increasing is because it gives the product a higher shelf life which helps in greater preservation of the food and is also more suitable for frying, and thirdly is cheaper as compared to other vegetable oils and pure ghee. Lastly, it has very harmful effects on the human body, especially because it causes heart diseases because it increases the amount of LDL and reduces the amount of HDL. Naturally also, trans fatty acids are found in your meat and dairy products, but again these are found in very small amounts, hence they do not cause any harm to the human body. Moving ahead, let's talk about cholesterol. Now, cholesterol and fats are both a kind of lipid. Hence, cholesterol is also a lipid. And both fats and cholesterol are found in the food which we consume and circulate in our bloodstream. The only difference between the two is that cholesterol has much more complex chemical structure as compared to fat. In the human body, cholesterol is usually bound to a protein. For example, the low density lipoprotein or the LDL and the high density lipoprotein or the HDL. Now, the good cholesterol is considered good because what it does, it picks up the excess cholesterol in our body and transports it back to the body's liver for further processing. And it is for this reason that HDL or the high density lipoprotein is considered as a good cholesterol. Bad cholesterol or the low density lipoprotein is considered bad for the human body is because it transports the cholesterol throughout the human body. That is, it would distribute the cholesterol throughout the human body, and then this cholesterol will build up in the wall of the body's artery. As you can see in this picture here also, the cholesterol eventually starts to build up in the inner walls of the arteries, due to which the arteries become narrower and narrower, eventually reducing the blood flow and leading to an increased chance of heart attack and stroke. Now coming back to Kerala government's initiative, the year-long action plan of the Kerala government has some specific components in which it wants to create awareness on the trans fat even amongst the food business operators and wants to give them scientific sessions and train them as to how to keep their food trans fatty acid free. So in addition to awareness campaigns, the Kerala government will identify manufacturers and suppliers of the PHVOs and will collect sample from them in order to monitor the content of the trans fatty acids in such oils. Further, it will also monitor oil and fats which are used for frying and making snacks. Further, it will meet with bakers, restaurants owners, etc. and educate them about the ill effects of the TFAs. And lastly, it will also prepare guidelines on the action to be taken against the violators. Now, all these efforts of the Kerala government is in line with the FSSAI's campaigns and targets to eliminate trans fatty acids from India. The Food Safety and Standards Authority of India is a nodal statutory body established under the Food Safety and Standards Act of 2006 and is responsible for protecting and promoting public health in India through regulation and supervision of food safety. Currently, it works under the aegis of Union Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So even last year, in December 2018, the FSSAI started a campaign called the Heart Attack Rewind, which wanted to warn citizens about the health hazards of consuming trans fats. Now, this media campaign by the FSSAI was in line with the FSSAI's target to eliminate trans fat from India by the year 2022. And this target of the FSSAI to eliminate trans fat from India by the year 2022 is a year ahead of the global target which is set by the WHO, where it wants to eliminate trans fatty from the world completely by the year 2023. Further, India is trying to move towards achieving this target of trans fat elimination by first reducing the levels of the industrially produced trans fatty acids to 2% from 5%. Therefore, FSSAI is also committed to reduce the industrially produced trans fatty acids to less than 2% by the year 2022 in a phased manner. Now in the year 2012, a question on trans fats was asked in the mains. You can try and attempt this question based on our today's discussion. With this, let's move on to our next news. This news has been taken from page number 1 and is talking about the lapse of the Citizenship Amendment Bill of 2019 as well as the Triple Talaq Bill. Now we have taken this news article in order to discuss the various scenarios under which a bill lapses. From the perspective of your syllabus, in the prelims it will form the part of Polity and Constitution, and for your mains it will form a part of GS paper 2 under the subcategory of Parliament and its functioning and conduct of business. We know that the Rajya Sabha, being the permanent house of the Parliament, is not subject to dissolution, and it is only the Lok Sabha which is subject to a dissolution. Now, dissolution of Lok Sabha can happen two ways. One is the automatic dissolution on the expiry of its tenure of 5 years as is provided under Article 83 subclause 2. So basically it means that every Lok Sabha after a completion of term of 5 years will automatically dissolve. Second way is through an order of the President. Now we will not go into detail as to when and how the President can dissolve the Lok Sabha, but you should know that under Article 85 Clause 2, the President of India does have the power to dissolve the Lok Sabha before the completion of its normal tenure. So basically when a Lok Sabha is dissolved, all the businesses including bills, motions, resolutions, petitions, etc. which are pending before that Lok Sabha also lapse or end. Further, all these resolution, motions, bills, etc. have to be reintroduced in the newly constituted Lok Sabha. Now, since we know that this budget session was the last session of the 16th Lok Sabha, so hence for practical purposes, the 16th Lok Sabha of India stands to be dissolved. Please bear in mind that currently the Lok Sabha has not been dissolved officially, but for practical purposes, the current Lok Sabha can be considered to be dissolved because it is not going to meet for another session again in its current tenure. Therefore, in this background, we are going to discuss what happens to various bills when the Lok Sabha is dissolved. Now let us try and understand the lapsing of the bills through these two tables. Now first we are going to discuss all those situations in which a bill will lapse. So we have the two houses of the parliament, the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. Now the first situation is when a bill is pending in the Lok Sabha, then in that situation that bill will lapse. Now here it does not matter whether the bill originated in the Lok Sabha or originated in the Rajya Sabha and then was transmitted to the Lok Sabha. In either of the situation, if a bill is pending with the Lok Sabha, it will lapse. Second situation is that a bill originates in Lok Sabha and it has been passed by the Lok Sabha and then it was sent to the Rajya Sabha where it is still pending. So if the bill is still pending with the Rajya Sabha after it has been passed by the Lok Sabha, then in that situation also the bill will lapse if the Lok Sabha has been dissolved. Now this third situation is very similar to the first one, in which the bill originated in the Rajya Sabha where it was passed and then it was sent to the Lok Sabha and where it remained pending. So again, since the bill was pending in the Lok Sabha, it will lapse. Now the second table will give us situations and circumstances in which the bill will not lapse in case of dissolution of the Lok Sabha. The first situation is that if the bill has originated in the Rajya Sabha and it is still pending with the Rajya Sabha. So if a bill is pending with the Rajya Sabha and has not been passed by the Lok Sabha, then it will not lapse. The second situation is where the bill has been passed by both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, but it is waiting the assent of the President. So if the bill has been passed and the President has not given his assent and in the meanwhile Lok Sabha dissolves, then the bill will not lapse. Third situation is that again the bill has been passed by the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, but the bill was returned by the President for reconsideration of these two houses. Even in that situation, the bill will not lapse because the bill has been passed by both the houses at least once. The fourth situation, if the bill has not been passed either in the Lok Sabha or in the Rajya Sabha, but the President, before the dissolution of the Lok Sabha, had notified for a joint sitting on that bill. So in that situation also, where the President has notified for the holding of a joint sitting before the Lok Sabha was dissolved, then in that situation also, the bill will not lapse. So the second, third and the fourth point is easy to remember, but the only thing which you again need to remember to have clarity is that the only time a bill will not lapse is when it is pending in the Rajya Sabha. In all these other situations, when the bill is pending in the Lok Sabha, or if it has been passed by the Lok Sabha and is pending in the Rajya Sabha, then the bill will lapse. Here in this situation, the bill originated in Rajya Sabha and had not been forwarded to the Lok Sabha. Therefore, since the bill originated in Rajya Sabha, it will remain so and will not lapse. Now in the prelims of 2016 also, a question was asked on the pendency and the lapses of the bill. The question was asking which of the following statement is correct. First, a bill pending in the Lok Sabha lapses on its prorogation. This statement is incorrect. Prorogation basically means that not only a sitting of the House is terminated but also a session is terminated. That is also the difference between adjournment and prorogation. Adjournment only terminates a sitting of the House, whereas prorogation terminates the session of an House. So when the session of a House is terminated, a bill pending in the Lok Sabha does not automatically lapse. A bill pending on the Lok Sabha will only lapse when the Lok Sabha is dissolved. Second, a bill pending in the Rajya Sabha, which has not been passed by the Lok Sabha, shall not lapse on the dissolution of the Lok Sabha. This statement was correct and it corresponds to this first situation we discussed in this table here, where the bill has been pending in the Rajya Sabha and has not been passed by the Lok Sabha. So the right answer to this question was B, 2 only. With this, let's move on to our next news. This news is an editorial taken from page number 8 and is talking about the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's visit to India next week, and therefore this editorial is providing us with a brief overview of India-Saudi relationship. From your syllabus, it will form a part of GS paper 2 in the category of India and its neighbourhood relation, as well as effect of policies and politics of developed and developing countries on India's interest and Indian diaspora. Let us now look at the current scenario of India and Saudi Arabia's relationships. The main pillar of India and Saudi Arabia's relation is oil. Saudi Arabia contributes almost 20% to India's crude oil requirement, thereby emerging as a stable and trusted supplier of oil to India. In addition to this, Saudi Arabia is also investing in several refinery projects in India, the very recent one of them being at Ratnagiri in Maharashtra. The second aspect of Saudi-India relationship is terrorism. After the 9/11 incident, both Saudi Arabia and India have joined hands in fighting terrorism by helping each other in the form of intelligence sharing, etc. Now, though at one hand, Saudi Arabia pledges its commitment to India to fight terrorism, but on the same hand, Saudi Arabia has not built any kind of pressure upon Pakistan to reduce terrorism in India and Afghanistan. Further, Saudi Arabia is also considered to be a hotspot of spreading radical Wahhabi ideology, which in turn again inspires terrorism. So, therefore, on the aspect of terrorism, though at one hand India and Saudi Arabia share their intelligence resources, but at the same time, Saudi Arabia indirectly supports terrorism because it is a hotspot of the Wahhabi ideology, and secondly, because it is not creating any pressure on Pakistan to stop terrorism in India and Afghanistan. Now, the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, though has been criticized worldwide over his Yemen war and the assassination of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, but India has refrained from criticizing Mohammed bin Salman in order to maintain cordial relationship between the two countries. The fourth and another very important aspect of India-Saudi relations is the country of Iran. Now we know that Saudi Arabia and Iran are stark enemies. And for Saudi Arabia, containing Iran is one of its top foreign policies. Further, Saudi Arabia receives a lot of support from US, Israel and other countries to contain Iran. But on the other hand, as far as India is concerned, India enjoys very cordial relationships with Iran, and as of now, only US has pressurized India to cut ties with Iran. But even in the wake of this pressure from US, India has been able to maintain its strategic autonomy and independence and somehow is able to balance its relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But again, let's not get too ahead of ourselves because it is very likely that this Iran issue will be brought up when Mohammed bin Salman will visit India next week. The next pillar of the Saudi-India relationship is trade. Saudi Arabia is India's fourth largest trading partner, but this trading basket between India and Saudi Arabia is very lopsided and is basically dominated by trade in crude oil. Therefore, as far as trade is concerned, there is a need to diversify the trade basket and by increasing India's exports to Saudi Arabia, especially in agricultural and pharmaceutical products, as well as some financial and ITES products. Next, Indian community is the largest expatriate group in Saudi Arabia because almost 2.7 million Indian people stay in Saudi Arabia. But of late, there are concerns of labor exploitation, induced religious conversions, as well as denial of basic rights for the Indians living in Saudi Arabia. Hence, the Indian community staying in Saudi Arabia requires attention of the government. Moving ahead, as far as strategic partnership between India and Saudi Arabia is concerned, the Delhi Declaration of 2006 and the Riyadh Declaration of 2010 elevated India and Saudi Arabia's bilateral relationship to a level of strategic partnership. This strategic partnership between the two is basically for the development of defense products, to strengthen maritime security, especially in the Gulf and the Indian Ocean region, etc. The next point is rather something which can become a bone of contention between the India-Saudi relationship. It is being expected that Saudi Arabia will become a partner of the CPEC project between Pakistan and China by investing in the Gwadar port. Now, this apparent move by Saudi Arabia to become a partner in the CPEC is opposed by India for obvious reasons. But at the same time, what is to be noted here is that though India opposes Saudi Arabia's partnership in the CPEC, but at the same time, India too is investing in the Chabahar port in Iran and wants to maintain a strategic autonomy for itself in the context of the Saudi-Iran rivalry. So therefore, just in the way India, who consider itself a friend of Saudi Arabia, is investing in Chabahar port in Iran, which is a rival of Saudi Arabia, thus in the same way Saudi Arabia too is investing and becoming a partner in CPEC, which is also opposed by India. The last pillar of this relationship is the country of Israel. Of late, the cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia have been increasing, especially because both of these countries want to contain Iran and ISIS. Thus, even in this growing cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia, India has been given an advantage because Air India has become the first airline to which Saudi Arabia has given permission to use Saudi airspace to enter or exit Israel. That is to say, Air India is the only airline which can use the Saudi airspace to enter or exit Israel. Now, these were the broad pillars of Saudi-India relationship. Now, since the news is in transit, we have to wait for Mohammed bin Salman's visit to India, and let's see what are the outcomes of that visit. With this, let's move on to our next news. This news appears on page number 7 and is in the context of the Saubhagya scheme. In your prelims, it will come under the economic and social development initiatives and schemes, and in your mains, it will fall under GS paper 2 in the subcategory of government policies and intervention for development in various sectors, as well as GS paper 3 in the category of infrastructure and energy. Now, the context of this article is that the government is implementing the Saubhagya scheme in order to ensure universal household electrification in India. Now, as per the government data, 100% rural electrification has been achieved in the state of Bihar, UP, Odisha and Rajasthan. However, according to a recent survey carried out by a private sector agency called Smart Power, only 84% of the rural households have access to electricity in these 4 states. So in this regard, let us understand some basic details about the Saubhagya scheme. Now, the Pradhan Mantri Sahaj Bijli Har Ghar Yojana, also known as the Saubhagya scheme, was started in September 2017. It functions under the Ministry of Power, though its implementing authority is Rural Electrification Corporation. The objective of the scheme is to achieve the goal of universal household electrification by 31st March 2019. That is, it wants that every household in our country, irrespective whether it is in rural area, urban area, poor, non-poor, every household should have an electricity connection by 31st March 2019. So under the Saubhagya scheme, the government will provide last mile electrical connection to all the remaining households in the rural area which are till now not electrified. That is, all those households who up till now do not have an electrical connection. All such remaining households in rural area will get connections under Saubhagya scheme. In addition to rural India, this scheme will also provide connections in urban India, but for those economically poor households who are unelectrified. That is, under the Saubhagya scheme, even in urban areas, electrical connection will be given to all those households which are economically poor and do not have an electricity connection. But please bear in mind, all those urban households who are not poor will not be provided with an electricity connection even if they do not have an electricity connection up till now. Now, realizing the fact that a lot of households in our country are located in very remote and inaccessible areas. Therefore, realizing that there might be places where grid extensions cannot be feasible. So, for such places under the Saubhagya scheme, the government will provide solar photovoltaic based standalone systems to provide electricity to such remotely located households. Thus, to recapitulate, you should remember that Rural Electrification Corporation is the implementing authority and the objective of the scheme is universal household electrification. Further, it will provide electrical connections to not just households in rural India but also to households in urban India which are economically poor and cannot afford electricity connection themselves. Lastly, in those areas where grid extension is not possible, in those remote and inaccessible areas, they will provide solar photovoltaic based standalone systems. Now next, a lot of you would be knowing that in 2014, the government had rolled out Deen Dayal Upadhyay Gram Jyoti Yojana. This scheme too focused on electrification. So how does Saubhagya scheme differentiate from this previous Gram Jyoti Yojana? The main difference is that this Gram Jyoti Yojana focused on village as a principal unit to measure electrification in our country. But on the other hand, the Saubhagya scheme focuses or takes into consideration individual households as a unit to measure electrification. Because what had happened under the Gram Jyoti Yojana was that many villages which were electrified in the past, in those villages, many households still did not have electricity connections. That is to say, the village was electrified, but certain households in that village still did not have access to electricity. Some of the really poor households did not have electricity cards and were not in a position to pay for the initial connection charges. Therefore, to bridge this gap, the Saubhagya scheme was launched with individual household as the principal unit to measure electrification. With this, let's move on to our next news. This news appears on page number 7 and is stating that the center has identified 106 coastal sites as conservation reserves to be protected under the National Wildlife Action Plan of 2017 to 31. From its syllabus, it will fall under GS Paper 3 in the category of conservation. Now, the National Wildlife Action Plan of 2017 till 2031 was unveiled in the year 2017. The plan is very exhaustive, thus it is not possible for us to discuss every aspect of this plan. But a few major points is that firstly, it is the first wildlife plan in the country which recognizes the concerns related to climate change. Hence, this plan includes integration of climate change into wildlife planning. Secondly, as far as the approach of this plan is concerned, it has adopted a landscape approach in its conservation methods. This action plan will focus on an entire landscape, including all animals and plants found in that landscape. Thirdly, the plan also lays emphasis on addressing the rising human-animal conflicts. Fourthly, this plan has underscored the increasing need for people's support for conservation of wildlife, and thus it recommends education, innovation, training as well as conservation awareness and outreach programs. Lastly, this action plan also wants to increase the participation of the private sector in the conservation of wildlife in our country. Now, what this news article is saying, that the center has recognized 106 coastal and marine sites as conservation reserves. These conservation reserves or community reserves are basically all those areas in which there is a larger participation of the local people in the conservation efforts. So therefore, to cap on the potential of the blue economy in our country, the government has recognized 106 coastal and marine sites as conservation or community reserves so that it can encourage the participation of the local people around these areas. Now, the selection of 106 coastal and marine sites was reported in the second biennial update report which India has given to the UNFCCC. Now, let us understand a few things about this biennial update report. We know that India is a party to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and as per the rules of this convention, India is periodically required to communicate relevant information with regards to the steps it has taken for the implementation of this convention or framework. Now, the Conference of Parties to this UNFCCC decide the reporting requirements for the various countries in accordance with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So accordingly, India had furnished its initial communication report in 2004 and then gave its second national communication in 2012. And it was in the year 2016 that India gave its first biennial update report or the BUR to the UNFCCC. So after 2016, now in 2019, India is giving its second BUR or the biennial update report, which is nothing but a built-up or rather an update of the first BUR. So basically, these biennial update report provide information regarding the national circumstances or the situations which are present in the country, the national greenhouse gas inventory, the various actions taken by the government to mitigate climate change, the domestic monitoring mechanisms, as well as information on finance and technology. Thus, in conclusion, this biennial update report is nothing but one of the obligations on India because it is the member to UNFCCC. With this, let's move on to our next news. This news has been taken from page number 3 and is stating that the foundation stones for the Subarnarekha port have been laid down in Odisha. From your prelims, it will form a part of geography, wherein the location of the Subarnarekha river becomes important. And for your mains, it will form a part of GS Paper 3 under the category of infrastructure and ports. The Subarnarekha river is one of the longest rivers flowing in the East India, and its drainage basin spans over 3 states, that is of Jharkhand, Odisha, and though a very little area, but of West Bengal as well. The Subarnarekha river is bounded by the Chota Nagpur plateau in its north and western side. This diagram here will show you that Subarnarekha drains Odisha, Jharkhand and even part of West Bengal. The main tributaries of the Subarnarekha river are Kanchi, Khakai and Kharkhari. As is obvious, the river drains into the Bay of Bengal. Now the Subarnarekha port, whose foundation stone has been laid, is touted to be built as an all-weather port in the state of Odisha, just at the mouth of drainage of the Subarnarekha river. This port is being developed by Tata Steel and Creative Port Development Private Limited with 51 and 49% stakes respectively. As per the reports, Tata Steel plans to use this port for its steel plant located at Jamshedpur as well as for other steel plants in Odisha and West Bengal. Other thing to remember is that the Subarnarekha port is developed as a commercial port based on the BOOST model. BOOST stands for Build, Own, Operate, Share and Transfer. Thus, the Subarnarekha port has been developed as a corporate port as it will be built, owned and operated by private companies. With this, let's move on to our next news. This news is an article appearing on page number 9 and is in the context of the Green New Deal. Now from your syllabus, it will be important for your prelims in the category of current events of international importance. Now this Green New Deal is in the background of the fact that US has withdrawn from the Paris Deal on climate change. So this Green New Deal is basically a program by the United States of America for moving America quickly out of the environmental crisis it is currently facing. This program has gained attention after the fact that the US withdrew from the Paris Deal on climate change. Now this Green New Deal has derived its name from the former US President Franklin Roosevelt's famous New Deal, which were a series of economic and social measures which were introduced by him in the 1930s in the wake of the Great Depression. So taking this New Deal forward, especially in the context of environment and climate change, this Green New Deal has been brought in, which aspires to make sweeping changes to the environment and economy to meet all of the US's power demand for clean, renewable and zero emissions energy sources by 2030. In addition to aiming at environment, this Green New Deal also addresses issues of racial and economic justice. Thus, in a lot of ways, this is more than just a climate change plan. With this, let's move on to our next news. Now, this news has been taken from page number 7 and is basically saying that the National Board for Wildlife had approved almost 99.82% of projects which had come to it for clearance. Now, we have spoken about the National Board of Wildlife in the DNS dated 13th January 2019. You can refer to this DNS for more information on the National Board for Wildlife. With this, let's move on to our next news. This news is an article appearing on page number 9 and is basically providing a critique of the PM Kisan scheme. Now, if you are following DNS regularly, you would know that we have covered PM Kisan scheme many times, and also in DNS dated 5th February 2019, we have spoken about the various components of this PM Kisan scheme as well as given a few problems or the challenges which the scheme will face. So you can refer to the DNS of 5th February to have information on the PM Kisan scheme. Now, based on our today's discussion, here are your prelims practice question. Please pause the video and solve them all. We'll discuss the answer after 5 seconds. The first question is related to the Saubhagya scheme. The first statement, it aims to ensure universal household electrification for all the rural and urban households. This is incorrect because the Saubhagya scheme does not include the non-poor urban households. It only includes the poor urban households. Therefore, it does not provide electrification to all households in the urban areas. Second, the Rural Electrification Corporation is the nodal agency for the implementation of the scheme. This is correct. Hence, the right answer is B, 2 only. Next, the question is with respect to the trans fats. The first statement, it occurs when saturated fat is hydrogenated. This is incorrect. It occurs when unsaturated fat is hydrogenated. Just like we had discussed, saturated fat cannot take in more hydrogen atoms. It is only the unsaturated fat which has the space for more hydrogen atoms which can be hydrogenated. Second, it increases the LDL in the body. This statement is correct. So the right answer is B, 2 only. Third, question is with respect to lapsing of a bill. The first statement, a bill pending in the Rajya Sabha but passed by the Lok Sabha will lapse on dissolution of the Lok Sabha. This is correct. Second, a bill which has been passed by both the houses but has been sent back by the President for reconsideration will also lapse. This statement is incorrect. A bill which has been sent back by the President for reconsideration will not lapse. So the correct answer becomes A, one only. Fourth question reads, Green New Deal seen in the news is related to, and the right answer is B, USA Climate Action Program. With this, we come to an end for today's discussion. Let's move on to the question for the day.